Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we are continuing our discussion of Swami Kriyananda's 26 Keys to Higher Awareness. We're up to number 17. Dwell more on the thought of giving of yourself. Jesus Christ said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive. Giving is expansive. The desire to receive, by contrast, is contractive. Energy and awareness grow as one's sympathies expand. They shrink, however, if one turns his sympathies selfishly inward upon himself." In another piece of writing, it was actually the expanded commentary to one of the recent scripture readings. This is May 6th, I think, 2016. The year is less important, but in the yearly cycle of Bhagavad Gita and Bible readings that form the heart of our Sunday services, Swamiji spoke. He was talking about ego. I no longer remember what the Bible verse was. But he talked about ego being the point of reference, that we are infinite in our true nature, but we are defined by the individuality that we're living at this point. Our individuality as a jiva is entirely impersonal. That's simply our infinite consciousness, and I don't know how you would describe it because I don't really experience it purely without the intervening filter of ego, being who I am, and the limitations of my own consciousness. But Swami talked about ego being our point of reference, meaning our that we see and experience life from the frame of the particular incarnation that we have taken, and it has a physical definition, cultural definition, all of the things that are created by having one physical body, and it is it has the characteristic of the vrittis, which are a kind of like the vibrating screen through which we interact with the world, through our senses, or however you want to think about it. I was corresponding with a friend earlier today, and his perspective on life is he has a tremendous amount of energy and a lot of inner energy that compels him. And he struggles with certain very strong vrittis. And I was realizing, just seeing, that it's like we all have this vibration of vrittis in front of us. I'm not sure if I can make the image perfectly clear, but this is how it seems to me, that creation itself is motionless. I mean, everything in creation is actually just the one expression of spirit, and perfect self-realization is to perceive spirit everywhere. But we have these vrittis. Vrittis are whirlpools of energy in the chakras, which represent certain vibrations of consciousness. Vrittis are our karma, because the vrittis are the vortices of energy that compel us in certain directions, that attract, repel, and compel us. And so when we view the world, and I don't just mean look at the physical world with physical eyes, but when we perceive reality around us, there's an oscillating field of energy that causes us to react and see and identify and feel and want and long and disappoint and rejoice, all the things that we do. And it's all because of the vrittis in the spine. Everybody's karma is different. Corresponding with my friend, he has had many similar life experiences that I've had, but because of the vibration of his vrittis, he perceives those experiences quite differently than I do. We can start with the same facts, and I'm not going to dispute his perception because he doesn't want me to, and it would be futile to do so. Futile in the sense that I don't think there would be any change in his perception, no matter how hard I advocated, because the vibration of his vrittis simply causes the world to look a certain way. Swami Kriyananda, who essentially had no vrittis, or I would say had no vrittis. He always just simply perceived things as they actually were. I know in his relationship to me, which of course is the thing that I know the most, but in what I also observed enormously in his relationship to others, but speaking of myself, everybody's multidimensional, and everybody is what they are. I find myself, even to myself, to be a bit complicated. And in my own motivations and my own reasons for doing things or not, it's taken me many years to understand myself, even to begin to understand myself. But from the very beginning, and now we're talking quite a long number of years ago, 45 years ago, from the very beginning, Swami always understood me. He just could see that pattern of vrittis, and he saw how those vrittis were distorting my perception, and then he could always sort of himself like come back through that to find the beginning point within me. It was as you can well imagine, an enormous comfort. And among many reasons why I trusted him so completely was because he knew me. He knew me better than I knew myself. It was sort of a joke once. I remember once I was having a rather difficult time, and he walked up to me and said, "How are you?" I said, "I don't know, sir." He said, "I'm a little worried about you." I said, "I'm worried about myself." And we went on from there. But after that, when he ever asked me how I was, I always said, "I don't know, sir, how am I?" Because I was much more interested in his point of view than mine. But I'm using myself as an example, but I watched him with everyone. Sometimes he would say something to me, explaining someone, or I watched him just so sensitively pick up what was really happening. Sri Yukteswar speaks to Master this way in Autobiography of a Yogi. He talked about trying to learn to hear, as I believe Sri Yukteswar called it, something like the confusion of men's verbiage. In other words, what people say is very often not what they mean. They might even believe what they say, but still, it may not be what they mean. And that's why Sri Yukteswar wanted Master to hear behind it. Behind what they're saying, go to the core of their being and see who they really are. And so this collection of individual karma, you might call it, that we are identified with. The ego is the jiva, the infinite individuality, identified with the limitation created by the body, but it's not just physical, because the body is also astral and causal, which is to say the spine and the chakras and the vrittis, that the jiva has identified with it. And our point of reference then becomes this individual reality. So then Swami goes on to talk in this particular commentary about how that individuality is simply fundamental to having a life on this planet. Even a master, Yogananda, was Yogananda. He didn't just incarnate as kind of an amorphous mass that just moved around like a cloud on this planet. In the early days of Ananda, when people were goofing around with the spiritual path, more I would call it, before we ourselves knew what we were doing, there was this one woman who was there for a while who always referred to herself as this unit of consciousness, which I just loved. We often would just joke about it. Instead of saying I, you would say this unit of consciousness. This unit of consciousness would prefer the chocolate cake to the banana cream pie. It was just, Swamiji always trained us to be lighthearted. No, don't take yourselves too seriously, even when you're talking about serious things like transcending the ego and God consciousness. There's no point being heavy about it. Master's entire poem of samadhi, which he taught us, recommended to us that we memorize and repeat every day in our meditations for its power to attune us, ends with these lines: a tiny bubble of laughter. I have become the sea of mirth itself. Isn't that fascinating? I've had lots of occasion to reflect on that. I know in these webinars in the last few weeks, the ones that yes, just the last few weeks, I was broadcasting from Portland, where I was staying because a friend of mine was dying. And it was amazing to me how mirthful it became as her consciousness shrank and shrank, and just all the elements of who she had been were just going away as her body went away and her options went away and her energy began to shift to the other side. And I've talked about it in these very webinars, so I won't go into it in great detail, but we were so mirthful. So many things were so funny, so way more funny than they really were. I've tried to repeat some of the jokes or the moments, and you gotta have been there, is what I end up thinking. But mostly it was so mirthful, and there was so much laughter. A tiny bubble of laughter, that's what it comes down to being. So Swamiji was always very lighthearted with us. So this unit of consciousness has always been something that we've enjoyed, especially applied in the most inappropriate circumstances, like German chocolate cake versus banana cream pie. If you're really just a unit of consciousness, it would seem to me you would be beyond such preferences. So the juxtaposition keeps you humorous. Well, anyway, even Master came in, his unit of consciousness, his jiva, which endures all the way up to and including self-realization. The bubble of laughter becomes the sea, but it remains, the sea is composed of all those bubbles of laughter. And so Master was Yogananda. He was Mukunda Lal Ghosh. He had a mother and a father. He writes extensively about his mother and father in his autobiography. He writes about his brothers and sisters. All of the book Autobiography of a Yogi, which has so many dimensions to it, it's been an integral part of my spiritual life and many people's spiritual lives for decades. And just every so often you see some extremely obvious aspect of it that never quite struck you before. And just the simple fact of how much actual energy he gives to his birth family. Whereas, in fact, detachment from one's birth family and so on is a fundamental part of the spiritual life, and Master did not give undue reverence to his family. For example, he went at one point when his father said something mildly critical about Master's guru, Sri Yukteswar. Master responded to his father that earthly life is something, but divine birth is everything. If you say one more word against my guru, I will disown you as my father forever. I mean, that was pretty powerful. But nonetheless, Master had a family, and he identified with it. He was not just a clear, moving unit of consciousness. He had his whole, everything that came with it. He didn't have vrittis, though, and this is where the issue begins to develop. He was Bengali, and he liked Bengali food, and he died reciting that poem to India about how much he loved India, and where he'd had many incarnations in many places. India was the mother of his soul, truly. Because it's true that the cosmic and divine assignment of India has always been to be the guru of the planet. And in this particular age where East and West are coming together, Master was born in India but lived in the West, but died speaking of India, because he was trying to set this cosmic pattern where the material efficiency of the West is united with the spiritual understanding of the East. And this is Jesus and Krishna together. This is the future for Dwapara. But nonetheless, Swamiji is saying, you have the ego and it's your point of reference. He said, but whether you reference that constantly back to yourself, or whether from that point of reference you begin to embrace and expand to the whole world, That's the critical factor, not whether or not you have an individual ego that you have to work through. And how profoundly you reference all your experiences back to yourself depends on the magnetism of those vrittis. Now, a vritti is a whirlpool, and the idea of the whirlpool is, if you think about the power of a whirlpool, is that it pulls everything into its center. And so when we have a particular experience of attachment, for example, that we're very attached to a person, let's say, as an example, a tremendous amount of energy circulates around that person. Think how how someone with a romantic attachment, they're just always thinking about that person, or a lifestyle, you become settled and everybody has their place in your life, and your thoughts circulate around it, and it pulls when energy is vibrating around a certain point like that, it pulls energy into itself. It's a funnel, a magnetic funnel, like a whirlpool in a river. If you drop something in close to that whirlpool, you'll see it just get sucked in. So with us, our vrittis are these spinning vortices, and they can be spinning vortices of self-doubt or antagonism towards someone, as well as attachment, fears, whatever it can be. And so everything that happens gets drawn into that vortex of energy. And the more powerful those vrittis are, the more everything that happens is referenced back to ourselves. That's why I was saying at the beginning, the vibrating vrittis just create the screen through which we look at everything. It's like if you have a screen, a carved screen, and the light is behind it, and you'll see the light on the other side, and it will assume the patterns of the light. The shadow and light will be determined by the carving. And so the divine light is shining through the pattern of our vrittis, and then the whole world assumes that pattern. Master, in Autobiography of a Yogi, tells the story about his own guru, Sri Yukteswar. And Sri Yukteswar, when Master asked Sri Yukteswar to tell him stories of his own childhood, Sri Yukteswar told a few stories, each with a moral. And he talked about his own attachment to a very ugly dog, and how no other dog would satisfy him. He had to have that one dog, and that was the only one he would accept. And Sri Yukteswar said attachment is blinding. It lends an imaginary aura of attractiveness toward the object of your desire. Desire is blinding. He had a desire for that dog, and he thought that dog was the most attractive dog there was. This is the pattern formed by our vrittis through which the light shines. To what extent Sri Yukteswar was playing a game, who knows, because he was an avatar, he had no vrittis. But that was the personality he assumed. The game that the masters play with this plane of consciousness is beyond me to unravel, so I won't try. So when our reference point, when our vrittis are strong, and therefore our view of the world is distorted because the light only shines through the pattern we've cut, then those vrittis continually draw things back to us. I mean, I've watched myself on many occasions when I have a strong predisposition. I hear certain things, I react rather than respond in certain ways. I perceive people's energy or actions in a certain way, and may or may not be accurate. It depends on, if the light is only shining through where the screen is clear, there can be a shadow over a certain spot, and something will happen behind that shadow, but you won't see it. I have noticed in myself and also in other people. There was a certain circumstance where I was hoping that certain people would understand this certain problem that I was facing, but it was, if they were to actually cognize the problem I was describing, for some of them it would have been a very inconvenient revelation. And so I observed, and it was quite amusing to me, that we would just be going along and having this conversation. Then when I would try to touch these certain points, it was like they would develop, this would be the opposite, they'd develop a hole in their brain. And I would talk, but I could tell that all my thoughts and words were just going into the hole in the brain. And then when I was finished, we just moved out, and then we were back again. I don't fault them. I have the same holes in my own brain. That's the pattern that we're working with. Now, our particular concept for today, dwell more on the thought of giving of yourself. Giving is expansive. The desire to receive, by contrast, is contractive. Energy and awareness grow as one's sympathies expand. They shrink, however, if one turns his sympathies selfishly inward upon himself. Now, selfishly inward has many nuances, many degrees. We can turn our attention selfishly inward, not really with ill intent. You can be self-centered and self-concerned without actually being selfish. Or to be selfish is yet another dimension. You can be generally generous, but nonetheless your vrittis are drawing all your energy into yourself. So when we're talking about this, just from the point of view of increasing energy and awareness, what we're trying to do on the most fundamental level is we're trying to dissolve those vrittis. We're trying to, even though we have to live in an ego, and this is our point of reference, we want to, as much as possible, be able to see situations without having to impose upon them this vibrating reality of self-concern. A very helpful phrase to keep in mind about the spiritual path in general is the idea of self-forgetfulness. Sometimes we become obsessive that we think what we're supposed to do is perfect ourselves, and I have seen a great deal of misery caused, again, in my own life and in the lives of others, by this idea that what we're really supposed to do is we're supposed to be perfect. And so we become extremely intent on doing it well and extremely dismayed when it doesn't go well. In the Bhagavad Gita, which was also this particular verse was one of our recent readings in this particular cycle at this time of year, which was that verse of the Gita, which I will paraphrase. But it speaks of, be constantly absorbed in the presence of God. And if you can't be constantly absorbed, then worship God. Do God-reminding things. And if you can't always keep your mind on worship, then be serviceful. Do the best you can, at least to be generous and serviceful to others. Serve God in others. And if even in this, as one of the translations says, thy faint heart fails you, then Krishna says, bring me your failure. And that is a very challenging teaching for almost everyone, because we imagine that what God wants from us is that we become perfect in the practice of the many virtues and the many techniques that are offered to us, whether it's Kriya or selfless service or Arati or Kirtan or whatever it is. It's natural for us, living as we do in the material world, to measure things by some kind of a material standard. This is how it's supposed to be done. This is what I should do. Even if we're talking about attitudes and responses to life, we still have a measurement going on. There was an article that came out in a magazine, this was 40 years ago. I kept the article for many years, but I finally threw it away. The magazine at that time was Psychology Today, I believe. And meditation was just beginning. And the article was called, it was in the Yoga Journal, I believe. It was called The Dark Side of Meditation. Everyone tries to sell their issues. The dark side of meditation. And the article said that many people who are attracted to a meditation practice are what was called then type A personalities. Maybe the vocabulary is different now. Type A personality, very competitive, very intense on perfection, always trying to, concentrate and do it right. And so you're attracted to meditation because if you're a type A person, you have a lot of stress and you need to find a way to relax your never-ending intensity. But then meditation itself becomes a kind of competition. And so instead of it actually alleviating that stress, it becomes yet a new source of stress. Swami himself remarked on it by saying, be ye therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. I mean, that's a pretty demanding standard. And so if your goal is divine perfection, you can always be coming up short. No matter how you measure it, you'll always be coming up short. The mere act of measuring it, of course, is the folly. But nonetheless, I actually have known people who find it unbearable. They're so inwardly competitive with themselves that the constant failure, which is to not yet be God realized, becomes they have to turn away from the path. That's not a joke. That's a really complicated but true inner reality. In the Catholic Church, they actually have a word for it because they've been at it so long, they have it all sorted out. It's called over-scrupulosity, where you just become so strained trying to be perfect that you lose track of what the whole thing is. So it's more accurate, actually, to say that what the spiritual path is self-forgetfulness, where the reference point is simply not yourself. And that even if what you're doing has not come out as well as it could, or even if you yourself realize that you could have put out more effort, but you were distracted and you didn't. But the vritti of self-concern sucks all that energy back in, and it becomes this thing that you mull over, and everything is always about me. And there's very little space even for the simple idea that God has his own plan. And you don't even know whether you succeeded or failed in the actual carrying out of God's plan. I heard a story in Thailand many years ago when we took our first trip to India in the late 80s, 1986, 87. We went through Thailand and actually spent a few days there. And in Bangkok, we went to see the Golden Buddha, which was really quite beautiful. And the story, as I remember it, perhaps over decades I've changed it, but I like the story as I remember it, as it was told to us, was the Golden Buddha was discovered some centuries before, even though it had been made many centuries prior to that. And the history of it had something to do like this, that the Golden Buddha had been made as a devotional act by a powerful monarch. And then that king was threatened by invaders. And he didn't want the Golden Buddha to fall into the hands of the enemy, whoever they were who were coming. So he had the whole thing covered over in some in plaster. And then he took it, he moved it just out by the bank of a river. So that even though it was a beautiful, impressive statue of the Buddha, its location and its appearance would not give away that underneath all of that there was gold, which of course the invaders would have wanted for their own purposes. But then, in fact, that king was defeated, and the memory of why that statue was there and what its true reality was became lost. Now, of course, there's also a divine analogy here. But this, as I understand it, is actually a true story, and that's the part that I'm interested in. Well, time passed, centuries passed, and someone began to feel that maybe the complexion of the population changed, that was too impressive a statue to be left in such an unimportant location, so they decided to move it. The thing was massively heavy, and it was very challenging to engineer its moving because this was before the age of trucks and cars and cranes. And so they managed to get it onto some kind of a wheeled cart, and they were transporting it from its riverside location to a more suitable temple. And the cart cracked apart, and the Buddha hit the ground, and it hit the ground with so much force that the plaster cracked. And of course, the first response was the response of tremendous anxiety, because this holy statue of the Buddha had smashed. But of course, when the plaster smashed, the gold was revealed. Now, there's a spiritual analogy there, but just in the physical terms, I always think about it in this way, that God needed someone with enough confidence and creativity to think that he could build the cart that could move the Buddha. But there also had to be a flaw in his plans, because there was actually a wholly different intention there. And it's not always easy when we are sincerely heading for a certain goal not to reach that goal. Especially not to reach that goal when we have some inner sense, but often that inner sense is false, that it's really my fault for some reason. But even when things go wrong, the only point of their going wrong is to peel off another layer or to smooth out another vibration of those vrittis and to understand, well, this is the filter through which I'm seeing the world, and this filter needs to be cleaned. Because you see, the only thing that matters is that we gradually remove those vrittis so that we can actually perceive reality without the confusion of the shadows and light created by our own misunderstanding. So when things go wrong in our life, when we have failures, and we reference those failures back to ourselves, the failure itself is unfortunate, perhaps. Perhaps it's a necessary link in a chain that's going someplace you don't even know where that place is. But when we reference it back to ourselves, this is the word Swami uses, we contract. And our awareness becomes one more tight vritti about, what about me, what about me, what about me, what about me? Whereas if we can just become self-forgetful, which is, as Swamiji says, when you make a mistake, it's important to acknowledge it. Acknowledge it in the sense of don't be defensive about it, don't pretend it didn't happen. Just acknowledge that, yes, there was a misunderstanding on my part. In some way, I was blinded. I went into the hole in my brain. I went behind the shadow of my own screen and I couldn't see clearly. It's important to know that because self-awareness is essential. But after self-awareness, the whole point of self-awareness is to become aware of what the true self is and therefore to forget, to become self-forgetful, to know that we're operating as the Masters operated. Swami Kriyananda never forgot what his responsibilities were. He always knew, it was very interesting, and he always knew what his responsibilities were, and he always viewed his decision in light of his responsibilities. He knew what I was thinking of. He knew his effect on people. He knew how people regarded him. He didn't hold that in any way that blinded him, but he knew it was a fact. For example, sometimes when someone needed to hear a correction or some information that might be difficult for them to accept, Swamiji often asked one or another of us who he worked with more closely to be the messenger. But not the messenger that Swami says you should do this, but to be the messenger who would endeavor to bring whatever challenging fact might be needed to the attention of the person who needed to see it. But Swamiji didn't necessarily want to identify with the unpleasant news, because he wanted always to be able to be the port of refuge. He wanted to hold the role of comforter, so that if the news became too challenging, they could always feel that they could go back to Swami for comfort and understanding. And the way I would put it to my mind is, above all, Swamiji always had to preserve the relationship. Jesus put it really touchingly in the Bible when he said at the end of his life, and none of the sheep were lost, none of the sheep which my Father gave me. None were lost except the one who chose to be lost. And he was referring to Judas, who, by his own will, turned away from what Jesus had to give him, although eventually Judas turned back also. But none of the sheep were lost is very important. What is the most important thing happening here? The most important thing happening is to dissolve those vrittis. And everything else, no matter how it looms in the moment, is actually completely trivial and quite transitory, because the only thing that goes with us is those vrittis. So failure of many kinds, failure in relationships, failure in work, failure to meet your own standard of sadhana, whatever it might be, keep trying, because the effort for perfection is about, what perfection does for us is it causes us to constantly do battle with the three gunas within us. Tamasic tamas, which is the guna which pulls our energy down and contractive and away from the light toward laziness or defensiveness or all those things. Rajasic energy, which just keeps us nervous without actually progressing. And sattvic energy, which is actually elevating to us. And at all times, that's the battle we're fighting, is the pull between elevating energy that's actually expansive and downward pulling energy that's contractive. And this, dwell more on the thought of giving of yourself, is one of those ways in which we actually move out of tamasic energy and move energetically, using rajas in the right way, to the sattvic quality of giving. And giving by its very nature requires that we reference and define ourselves by a greater world than just the rotating world of our individual vrittis. So it becomes in itself, and it's a very tangible kind of practice, Who am I thinking of? What am I doing for others? Swami Kriyananda says service, outward service to others, he said, is one of the best ways to overcome the ego. Just in the simplest situation, you're sitting at a dinner table and somebody has to get up from the dinner table to serve the meal. Somebody has to clear the table afterwards. Somebody has to wash the dishes. Somebody has to mop the floor. Do you look yourself to be the one who gets to sit and be served? Or do you think, let me do this for everyone else? Let them sit and enjoy while I get up and make it work for all of them. Why, if I see something beautiful, as Swami Kriyananda said, he said he always had an affection for beautiful things. He was raised in a very refined family, in a very fine social milieu, and himself just had very refined taste. And he talked about once being in, I was going to say in Israel, but I'm not sure if it was Israel. It might have been in Greece or somewhere in Europe. It completely doesn't matter. But he was somewhere and he saw a beautiful carved wooden statue of the Madonna and Child. And he said it was $12. Can you imagine? That was a lot of money at the time. It's hard even to think about it. $12 hardly buys a cup of coffee now. But it was $12, and so he had to think about whether he could afford it or not. But then he thought, and he was hesitating, but then he thought of a sister disciple who he thought would really enjoy it. And so he bought it. Instead of buying it for himself, he bought it for her. So as he put it, he had the satisfaction of purchasing it, of not leaving it in the shop, because it was beautiful and he didn't want to leave it in the shop. He wanted to bring it into his world. But then he gave it to her. And he said, in a certain way, he actually may have enjoyed it more because he saw it every time he visited her. If he'd had it in his own home, he said he might have grown accustomed to seeing it. But because he only saw it occasionally, every time he walked into it, he enjoyed it completely. And that's a very small thing, but not such a small thing. To be able, as Master puts it in one of his Whispers from Eternity. The book Whispers from Eternity is an amazing book. In the introduction to the editing that Swami Kriyananda did of that book, this is it right here, the edited version that Swami did. He says at the beginning, he says, perhaps more than any other of Master's writings, he said, Whispers from Eternity molded my attitudes on the spiritual path. It was very interesting to hear, because it's not a philosophical book. It's not commentary on the Gita or explanation of the Rubaiyat or something like that. But what Whispers from Eternity does, and it's fascinating to read through it from this point of view, somewhere on the internet, you'll find an audio recording of a class series I gave on Whispers from Eternity. Maybe there's a video too, but on the Ananda Palo Alto website you can find it, I think. Is that every challenging experience in life, there's a prayer somewhere in Whispers that tells you how to regard it. So how to think about, disappointment, how to think about criticism from others, how to think about success, how to think about sadhana, how to think about disappointment on the spiritual path. Everything. It's all in there, and there's a poem that tells you what to do. Shipwrecked on the island of disappointment. I threw myself on the sands of despair until the sail of your rescuing vessel came and took me away from it. And so you really have, if you think about it, you have the whole cycle. You feel like your life has crashed, you don't know what to do. How are you ever going to get out of there? Well, the sailboat of grace is going to come and take you out of there. But there you are, you're shipwrecked on the island of your disappointment. So it's not as if Master, he's poetic, but he doesn't in any way pass over what really happens to you inside. And one of Master's whispers is very sweet. He says, teach me to spend for others as easily and generously as I spend for myself. I've always enjoyed that. It's just so simple. Because you think, oh, look, a beautiful pair of shoes. Oh, there's some nice curtains for the house, a beautiful statue. I think I'll buy it. But what if, just as easily and generously, you buy for others as you buy for yourself? Now, Master didn't say, interestingly, that you not buy for yourself, because he was also very balanced. He didn't say, teach me never, ever, ever to have anything nice of my own, but only to make sure that everybody else has nice things, because this then also can create too strong a vortex of self-concern, where we're always becoming over-scrupulous, and anything I want, I shouldn't want. But more to just be in that flow. Let me always think first, dwell more on the thought of giving to others. How in this circumstance can I give? And that means, personal relationships, and in a balanced way. And this is, all of self-realization presupposes psychological health. Because sometimes people are self-sacrificing not because of a balanced generosity of nature, but because in fact the vritti of unworthiness is so intense that everything actually is feeding the unworthiness vritti by behaving in a self-abnegating way. Never feeling that I have any value, but everybody else has more value than I. It's a little subtle. But once there is a balance inside, we think more of giving to others in the way that is expansive and appropriate. That's the words here are expansive versus contractive. Energy and awareness grow as one's sympathies expand. They shrink if one turns his sympathies selfishly inward upon himself. Your sympathies can be selfishly inward upon yourself by constant self-abnegation. By diminishing your self-worth is also selfish, strangely, because it's a hole in your head. It's a vritti not allowing you to see reality clearly. Self-forgetfulness is the actual key. So let me just trace that one for just a moment. Let me find it more clearly. Impersonal, that was the word I was looking for. You see, for Swami Kriyananda, he was responsible for Swami Kriyananda, and Swami Kriyananda had a certain reality that had to be carried out. And there were appropriate things that he needed. There were times when the work that he was doing just had to be done, and he wasn't able to accommodate everybody's desires for him. People wanted him to do this, or wanted him to do that, or wanted this from him. But he also had other things that he himself knew he had to accomplish. And it wasn't selfish for him to just impersonally posit the real requirements of his incarnation against the inclinations of others as well. And that impersonal balancing, true humility, Master said, is simply honesty. It's a very interesting, extremely interesting phrase, and I think about that a lot. I actually had to trace out I was talking to someone who has a serious drinking problem. And sometimes if you have a serious drinking problem, that's a pretty big vritti that distorts your perception of reality. And I have great sympathy for the impulse to try to change your consciousness by some kind of a shortcut. That's really what we're talking about. When we do things that dull our awareness, and we're doing them because what we're aware of is too painful to endure. And that's not a joke. That's very serious. The difficulty, of course, is very, very simple. It doesn't work. If it worked, there would be no objection. But it doesn't work because consciousness has its own destiny. And that destiny is that we must face and resolve all of those vrittis. And you can dull your awareness of those vrittis, but it doesn't change the vrittis. You dull your brain, you dull your the physical vehicle you're using to experience your own consciousness, but it's just a physical thing that you're doing. It can't actually amend your consciousness. But there has to come a point, and I am no expert on addiction by any means. I have an extremely peripheral relationship with it in this life. But the only thing I can call it is I have a memory. I have a samskar. Master said strangely, anything you're not drawn to do in this incarnation, that you realize it's not going to work for you, it's not going to bring you what you want, is because you've tried it and you found out that it didn't bring you what you wanted. Master said we have to experience everything. That's quite a statement, and it's a really big one. That's a really big bite to chew and swallow. The Master says we try everything, and only from our experience do we actually learn. Which means that all the masters have been through every stage of human ignorance and human freedom. So when Yogananda says, I understand, to someone who's struggling with some delusion, he really does, because he was there and he walked through it. That's another reason why we mustn't take our failures too much to heart, but bring them to the altar of God and say, well, there it is. You got yourself through this, you show me how to get through it. So I have a samskar of some sort that I remember. I remember trying drugs and drinking and all of the other cycles, and I'm not particularly drawn to drugs or drinking, but many other delusions still grab me, and the desire to resolve my consciousness by some shortcut is part of us all. But I tried to think to myself, why? How did I ever turn that? And I realized the first step always has to be self-honesty. You have to really be able to just look at yourself and say, this isn't working for me, and it's not anybody's fault. It's not because my parents drank too, and so they imprinted on my genetic code, and it's not because my own experiences have been so terrible. It's nothing. It's just because I'm hoping that there's a shortcut, and the self-honesty to finally really see life for what it is and realize there is no shortcut. Takes a lot of courage. So courage is the other quality. On the spiritual path, in his course on discipleship that Swami Kriyananda wrote when he was in charge of the monks in SRF, back in 1950, he wrote a series of lessons that they used to train the monastics. Essential attitudes of the devotee. The first attitude was courage. Interesting. Even before devotion was courage. Because you have to have the courage to say, there's no shortcut. That God is the only answer, and I'm going to just start down that road, and no matter how many vrittis suck me into whirlpools that take me off of this path, away from the straight line. I've seen it in myself and I watch it in others. It's so clear to us internally what we're trying to do, but it's like we head out in what we think is a straight line, and our vrittis just curve it, and we don't even really know it. When I said at the beginning of this about how Swamiji always understood me, he always knew what I meant to do, no matter how it came out. And very often you have such a good intention, and it just gets so messed up, either by clumsy execution or by misunderstanding on the other side. Swamiji once said to me, and I was very comforted by this, he used the phrase, God reads the heart. He said, we're responsible for our intentions. In other words, we're responsible for the purity of our hearts. If between the intention and the expression something goes wrong, God relates to us according to the intention. So then you have to be self-honest enough to know that if one of the meannesses of the heart was motivating you, you have to have the courage to say, yep, that's right. When we were engaged once in an intense political struggle at Ananda village, making an effort to incorporate Ananda village as a California city. It's a long and very interesting story. I tell it in my book, Swami Kriyananda as We Have Known Him. And in the end we lost, and lost gloriously in the effort to incorporate. We won. It accomplished many other good things, but the actual object of incorporating as California city just went down, 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 and never came back again. The purpose was to, a municipality in California is the one entity that has zoning and land use control, and that's what we wanted. We wanted to be able to declare our own zoning within the boundaries of our own community, and not have to go to the county supervisors whose interests were widely different from ours. We were quite responsible and could have done it very well, but it wasn't meant to be. But it was quite contentious, and we were quite opposed by many people in the area. And in the end, we ourselves, we were defeated, and then we gave up our appeal, as that was really what it amounted to. And it finally came down. It was very interesting within me. I didn't mind losing. I felt, certainly I had done my best. We'd done the best we could do. If we were going to lose, that was God's will. But I didn't like that the people who had opposed us had won. It's just that this little meanness of the heart was there. I wanted them to be defeated. We could be defeated too, but I also wanted them to be defeated. And I just had to say, that's how I feel. But interestingly, just oddly, I became very sick and I had a very high fever, which I have only had a few times in my life. But it was like that meanness of my heart created this burning through my whole body. And after the fever was over, I didn't care anymore. It wasn't worth it, even to have an opinion. Some meannesses of the heart are harder to get rid of. But this is, we come back to dwell more on the thought of giving of yourself and less on what's in it for me. It's more blessed to give than to receive. That's what Jesus said. And what the word blessed means is it's more blissful. It's more blissful not to be dwelling in those little self-centered vrittis. It's interestingly, in my childhood, I came to the path of self-realization just before I was 19 years old, when I was still 18. And I found Swami Kriyananda about 4 years after that. But I got very serious 3 years after that. But I was very serious really from the first minute. I was 19 when I found self-realization, and 22 when I met Swami Kriyananda. And yes, I'd always been restless when I was younger. Restless in not in the sense of wanting to wander or not able to sit still, but I was inwardly, I felt confined, and I was pushing against this feeling of confinement, and it manifested more in the thoughts of, what am I going to do with my life? You know, what's going on in this planet? I remember staring out the window when I was a child and just thinking there's just something really wrong with what I'm seeing. And it was wrong in the sense that I was just looking at a very sort of ordinary suburban world, which did not attract me. And there was also something like fundamentally wrong. I can kind of remember like squinting a little and trying to see it from another angle. Was I remembering the astral world, that it looked physically wrong, that I knew there was something on the other side of it? I really don't know. But later, when I understood the ego, when I began to learn about the ego, I can't say I ever understand even, but when I began to learn about the ego and how the infinite self, the true self, the jiva, infinite in nature, becomes identified and thus confined to this one little tiny thing. And I realized that's what I was always chafing against, was this incredible sense of confinement. And I just didn't know where the door was. I knew the door wasn't to make that world work, to go out into that suburban world and get my own suburban house and my own car and my own family and my own career. It's just like, it was bigger than being 10 years old and looking out the window, but by an increment of, a quarter of an inch. I could feel that the compelling, expansive urge of my nature would not be satisfied. All of this is very sophisticated language that I didn't have at all when I was 10, but I had the perception. I had the whole perception. I just didn't know what to call it. Our whole consciousness, our whole destiny is there from conception, actually. Give it reincarnation. I mean, you're no less intelligent, conscious, spiritually motivated when you're 1 day old than you are when you're 100 years old. And the difference between children and adult is language and context. So there was a contraction that I felt that I wanted to get out of. And then I found self-realization, which showed me I could be Satchidananda. I could be ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new joy. And I just recognized it. Oh, that's it. That's what I'm looking for right there. And there was then this, the rest of the teaching of how to get there. And when I met Swami Kriyananda, and he so totally exemplified it in himself, personified. He was the personification of what I wanted to be. And he had a community I could live in. The phrase no-brainer didn't exist at that time, but that's what it was. Look, there it is. And just, that was it. And I never looked back. Dwell more on the thought of giving of yourself. It is more blessed to give because it's more blissful, because it's more true. When we break the confining reality of all the little vrittis and self-identifications we've been carrying for so long, and then just begin to offer our consciousness out into the infinite, then the very things that we think we have to satisfy in order to be blissful, all of those needs and worries and samskars, all we have to do is forget them. We just have to forget them, not suppress them, but just realize it was never who I was. And it all begins just with that simple thought. How can I give? How can I reference? How can I turn that ego reference, instead of inward on myself, outward to all of creation and to God? Bless you.